There's a food sitting in fridges all over the world right now that exists because of a mistake. And that exact mistake has been repeating itself, the same way for nearly 9,000 years. Nobody planned it, nobody understood it, and yet generation after generation kept making it happen again. Entire cultures built traditions, meals, even economies around it. And for most of that 9,000 years, the thing actually responsible for it stayed completely hidden, quietly shaping the food while everyone making it had no idea it was even there. The story of how that accident started and how it never stopped begins with something much simpler. A bag of milk, a hot afternoon, and a discovery nobody was trying to make. The milk was thick, sour, completely changed. Hours earlier, it had been poured into a bag made from a goat's stomach, still warm, still smelling the way milk always smells. Now it smelled sharp. The texture had shifted from liquid to something closer to a soft curd. Nothing about it looked like food anymore, and yet someone tasted it anyway. Maybe they were hungry. Maybe throwing it away simply wasn't an option. Whatever the reason, that decision, made by someone whose name we will never know, somewhere in the Middle East roughly 9,000 years ago, is the first domino in a chain that ends with yogurt sitting in your fridge right now. To understand why anyone would try this again, you need to picture the situation these people were actually in. Around this time, something genuinely new was happening across the region. People weren't just hunting animals anymore, they were keeping them. Goats, sheep, eventually cattle, living alongside families, producing something day after day that nobody had been able to count on before: milk. For the first time in human history, here was a food source that didn't require killing anything. Every morning, more of it. Except milk doesn't wait. In a hot climate with no clay pots, no cellars, nothing cold, fresh milk had a window measured in hours before it became genuinely dangerous to drink. Not just unpleasant, dangerous. That's the tension sitting underneath this entire story. Milk was abundant, and milk was a problem. What turned that problem into a food, into yogurt, came down to one thing: the bag it was carried in. Pottery wasn't the main solution here. What people had were skins, hides, and most usefully, the stomachs and intestines of animals they had already slaughtered, dried out, sewn shut, shaped into containers for carrying liquid. These containers weren't clean in any sense we'd recognize. The inner lining of a dried stomach holds onto residue, and clinging to that residue were bacteria, specifically types that feed on the sugar naturally found in milk. So picture it. Milk goes into a bag that's already coated with these organisms. The bag travels through a warm afternoon, jostling against someone's side, and for hours, completely unnoticed, those bacteria are eating, multiplying, quietly turning the milk into something else. By the time the bag is opened, what's inside isn't milk anymore. It's yogurt, or at least the very first version of it. Now, most of the time, this probably just got thrown away. Spoiled milk smells wrong, and most people, most of the time, trust that instinct. But here's where the story gets bigger than one bag, one person, one moment. In 2018, researchers studying pottery fragments from a place called Takarkori, a rock shelter in what's now southern Libya, found something that shouldn't have been possible. Chemical residue inside vessels dating back roughly 7,000 years showed clear signs of processed dairy fat. Not just milk, processed milk, fermented milk, and Takarkori sits in the middle of the Sahara, one of the driest places on the planet, which means thousands of years before anyone wrote a word down, in a region now buried under sand dunes, people were already making something like yogurt on purpose. Not as a one-time accident, as a method, and they weren't the only ones. Similar residue, similar evidence, has turned up in pottery from the Near East and parts of Europe, dated to roughly the same window. Separate cultures, no contact with each other, all arriving at the same food independently. This wasn't one lucky moment. It was the same accident, happening again and again, anywhere people had milk, heat, and an animal skin bag, and gradually, across generations, people learned to tell the version that was safe to eat from the version that wasn't. Now, here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. The people responsible for this discovery, the herders whose entire lives revolved around these animals, a huge number of them couldn't properly digest the milk those animals were producing. In the early populations across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, most adults were lactose intolerant. Drinking fresh milk didn't just taste unpleasant to them. It made them sick, cramping, real physical discomfort, the kind that would make anyone hesitant to rely on milk as food. And yogurt, of all things, was the fix. When the bacteria in that bag feed on the sugar in milk, they don't just thicken it and change the flavor. They consume a large share of the very thing that was making people sick. What came out the other end was dramatically easier on the body than what went in. The ruined milk wasn't a downgrade. For a huge portion of the population, it might have been the first version of milk their bodies could actually handle, which means yogurt wasn't just a way to use up milk before it spoiled. It was the version of milk that finally worked. So what was physically happening inside that bag to turn milk into yogurt? Strip away the lab terms, and it's almost suspiciously simple. There are two main bacteria responsible here. Picture them as two tiny workers, eating the natural sugar in milk and leaving behind acid as waste. That's the whole mechanism. Sugar goes in, acid comes out, but that acid does two important things, and both of them are what make yogurt. yogurt. First, it changes the structure of the milk. The proteins that were floating loose start clumping together, tightening into the thick texture that gives yogurt its body. Liquid becomes gel. Second, and this is the part that sounds almost backwards, that acid creates an environment hostile to other bacteria. The dangerous kind. The kind responsible for making warm milk genuinely unsafe. So the texture that makes yogurt and the safety that made it trustworthy came from the exact same reaction. One accident, two results. And here's where the story takes its biggest turn. Once people noticed the pattern, once they figured out that saving a spoonful of yesterday's batch and stirring it into fresh milk would make the same thing happen again, something shifted that changed everything that came after. Yogurt stopped being an accident. It became a recipe, the first one most of these communities had ever needed to repeat on purpose, batch after batch, passed down without ever being written anywhere. The mistake had been turned into a method, and from this point on, yogurt would never be lost again. That repeatability is what let yogurt travel. Along trade routes and migration paths, the same basic process, milk, warmth, a spoonful of the last batch, kept producing the same result, in completely different places, adapted into completely different foods. Thick-strained yogurt in the Eastern Mediterranean, drinkable fermented milks across Central Asia. Different names, different textures, same 9,000-year-old trick underneath. For most of that time, yogurt's reputation was practical, not glamorous. It kept, it traveled. It didn't make you sick, that was enough. The reputation started to shift in 1905, when a researcher named Elie Mechnikov noticed something odd. Certain populations who ate enormous amounts of fermented milk seemed to live unusually long, healthy lives. And he had a theory that sounded bizarre at the time, that something alive inside the yogurt itself was good for the people eating it. He wasn't entirely right about the details, but he was the first person to suggest in writing that yogurt wasn't just surviving food. It might be doing something for the people who ate it. That idea is part of why yogurt sits in the health food aisle today, instead of being remembered as the food people made when they had nothing better to do with spoiling milk. So here's where this lands. That spoonful of yogurt in your fridge is the end point of an accident that happened 9,000 years ago, in a bag nobody designed for this, made from an animal nobody thought twice about. And it solved three problems at once without anyone planning for any of them. It kept milk from going to waste. It made dairy safe in places with no way to keep food cold. And for huge numbers of people whose bodies couldn't handle milk at all, it was the first version they could actually eat. Nobody invented yogurt. Someone tasted the wrong thing 9,000 years ago, and it turned out to be exactly right. We've been eating it ever since.